I ended up meeting Ed Ruscha in San Francisco via Joe Good, who's also a painter. And when I was maybe 18 or 19 years old, grew up in the San Joaquin Valley, and Joe, I'd heard about this artist who had a studio up there, and so I got his number and I called him and asked him if I could do a studio visit. And I went and saw him, and he gave me some posters and books and this and that, and I said, this is what I want to do with my life. He had this studio on a horse ranch, and he suggested I go to Cal Arts, and ended up getting into Cal Arts. And then when I got out, after waiting on tables and stuff like that for a little while, I called Joe up just to say hi and decided I really would rather be a studio assistant. And I asked Joe if he knew of anybody, and so he hired me on the spot. And on my first day of working, he took me around to meet everybody, and his next door neighbor was Sam Francis. So in 1989, I met Sam Francis, and then Joe he had a studio on Electric Avenue, and Ed Ruscha was right down the street. So he took me to meet Ed. And about 3 weeks later, I got a call from Ed asking if I would also like to be his studio assistant. And so I just immediately got plugged in. Sam he would travel around. And so when he would come into town, his main studio person would set the studio up. And sometimes there was these giant canvases that needed to be stretched or moved around. So I would get a phone call asking if I could stop by and help. And we'd pull out these, 14 by 20 foot canvases. And so I go to Sam's studio, and it was this giant room. And I would stand in there, and I would just imagine what it was like to have this much space. And what I loved about Sam, was the freedom that he gave himself to make marks. Getting to go through Sam's inventory, pulling out paintings, row after row after row, and seeing the early works all the way up to the grids that he did, watching how he built, one idea led to the next, to the next, to the next. And you realize as an artist, that's what you have to do. And you find your little plot of land that you plant your seed, and then you cultivate it, and it grows. His eyes sparkled with this amazing light. And he was just a little guy, but he was so happy, and just, you felt good about being around him, and it's like, yeah, this is what I think it should mean when you're an artist, is to feel this way about life, and not be, he was never brooding. He was just always up and happy and very generous. I remember Joe said, come on, I want to introduce you around. The first day I started working for him. We walked down to Ed's studio and rang the doorbell on the gate, and this gate opens up, and there's Ed. And it was my first impression was that he was like a movie star. He seemed larger than life. He had this giant studio in Venice Beach, and he, after about 3 weeks after I met him, he called me up and asked if I could come and work for him one day a week also. And I said, yeah, that'd be great. And right off the bat, he just gave me the keys to his place, and we just connected. We did trips together. We'd go out to the desert together. We did a couple of road trips down to the tip of Baja, California, me and Ed and Billy L. Bankston, which was great fun. And just talking to these guys. And Ed, this painting right here is 1959, and it is actually owned by Ed's brother Paul, who's a very good friend of mine. And I just love this painting because you see Ed figuring out how to get past abstract expressionism. How does he make up? So this is not an abstract painting, it's a painting about abstraction. And so by doing this simple little line around it, now it becomes a quotation of abstraction. This is almost becoming a word, abstract. And I just thought that, God, that's so simple, but so genius and brilliant to make that move. When I was going to Cal Arts, there wasn't a day that went by where his name wasn't mentioned. Like the father of conceptual art and all this stuff. And one time we were out in the desert, and I told him that. He was so surprised to hear that. He said, he's like, I'm a painter. I'm an artist. Way back when, he and Joe decided, it would be best if I could find a studio near their studio. So at lunchtime, we would drive around looking for a studio space. And we found one a couple of blocks away, and of course, it was way too expensive. I couldn't afford it. And Ed was like, well, you have to take this. This is like the perfect studio. And I said, I can't afford this. And he said, yes, you can. I just gave you a raise. And so did Joe. We're going to guarantee you 5 days a week work between us. You need this studio. It's time. And that, you know, having that kind of support was huge. And he would come over once a week, at least, and see what I was doing, look at my paintings, we would talk about them. It's funny, when I got out of Cal Arts, I thought, I want to work for him. So I wrote him a letter and I took it to his gallery and asking, you know, please call me, I want to be your studio assistant. Well, of course he never got the letter. And then 2 years later, or 3 years later, there I was working for him. And I told him that I'd done that. And then he said to me, he goes, that first time you went and met Joe Good, he said, after you left, Joe called me. He said, this kid just came by. He said, so I've been waiting for you. Years and years ago, I started this whole thing with, after I got to Cal Arts, I wanted to undo everything I had learned to do. And I thought, how do I get outside of myself? And I was looking a lot at Renaissance paintings, and they have these beautiful ribbons sometimes floating in the air. And so I thought, well, that's so abstract, seemed to me more abstract than abstract paintings. And so I started throwing my own ribbons, and that got me going in this direction. I started wondering what my thoughts might look like, you know, before language is attached. And this has just gone and gone and gone and gone and gone over the years. And this latest piece of work, this body of work is, I was staring at this Leonardo da Vinci painting, a portrait. And I thought, you know, it's such an amazing, mystical painting. How can I, 400 or 500 years later, have a dialogue with Leonardo da Vinci? So the colors and everything else is being pulled directly from that painting. Everything in history is now available. So why can't I have a conversation with Leonardo da Vinci and Rembrandt and Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock all at the same time? Because they're all part of an historical landscape. So and this thing has layers and layers and layers and layers. I do a glazing process like the old masters. These movements are about my figure, my physicality. So how do I make an abstract painting but not have abstraction be a means to an end? Almost like Ed's abstract painting over there. And how do I make a figurative painting but not tell a story about figurative art history? The process is very similar to the old masters, and I use a glazing technique. Initial movement is very spontaneous. It's never pre-planned or anything like that. And I make a little bucket of paint, and I'll load up a brush, and I just start moving. And it's very rhythmic and calligraphic. It's almost like a form of automatic writing, I think. And then once that spontaneous moment happens, then that becomes my subject matter, and I start to go back into the painting, defining the spatial quality of it, what's going to be on front, what's going to be behind. And when these things are finished, there's probably 70, 80 layers of paint. The light, it is able to penetrate into the surface and then reflect back out, which gives them a sense of being illuminated from within.